This is the moment the Gulf stopped breathing, not metaphorically, not as a dramatic way of describing a tense week in diplomatic circles. Literally, the moment American missiles hit three separate locations along the Strait of Hormuz on a Tuesday evening, the entire energy infrastructure of the world's most critical waterway went quiet. Ships stopped moving, ports went dark, trading floors in London, Singapore, and Houston lit up like emergency rooms. As of 11:17 p.m. Gulf Standard Time, Tuesday, the United States military confirmed a series of precision strikes against what the Pentagon described as active threat infrastructure in the northern Gulf region. No advance warning was given to regional governments through diplomatic channels. Saudi Arabia learned about it the way everyone else did, through a Pentagon press release and a social media post from the Secretary of Defense, sent at 11:19 p.m. Iran had already begun moving naval assets within 40 minutes of the first strike. The price of oil jumped 11.4% in after-hours trading within 90 minutes of the announcement. Not 2%, not 5%, 11.4%. And Oman, a country that has quietly served as the back channel between Washington and Tehran for the last 6 years, had gone completely silent. Their foreign minister, who had been in Washington just 48 hours earlier for what officials described as productive consultations, canceled every public appearance and stopped responding to calls from the State Department. In this breakdown, we are going to walk through exactly what was struck and why it matters. We are going to show you what the Gulf states knew before it happened and what that silence from Muscat actually means. We are going to explain the market mechanics behind why your energy costs are about to become a political issue in your home country, regardless of where you live. And we are going to tell you what the next 72 hours will determine. Because the decisions being made right now in Riyadh, Tehran, and Washington will set the terms for everything that follows. The United States did not just conduct a military strike, it broke something that took 20 years to build. And the people who built it are now deciding whether to walk away from the wreckage or burn the rest of it down. 3 years ago, the situation in the Gulf looked completely different. The Abraham Accords had created a framework of cautious normalization between Israel and several Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and Iran had signed a surprise Chinese-brokered reconciliation agreement in March 2023 that reopened embassies and reduced proxy conflict pressure across Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq. American military presence in the region had been slowly recalibrating. Fewer boots on the ground, more over-the-horizon capability, more reliance on Gulf partners for frontline security architecture. The plan, as it had been described by 3 consecutive administrations, was to reduce American direct exposure in the Gulf while maintaining strategic dominance through technology, intelligence sharing, and targeted rapid response capability. It was supposed to reduce cost, reduce casualties, and reduce the kind of entanglement that had defined the post-2003 American military posture in the Middle East. It was supposed to deliver stability without occupation. Gulf states invested in this framework. Saudi Arabia restructured its Eastern Province defense coordination around the assumption of American over-the-horizon response. The UAE built its commercial infrastructure, its ports, its logistics networks, its financial architecture, on the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain functionally open and that American deterrence would keep it that way without requiring constant visible military action. Qatar hosted the largest American air base in the region on the same foundational assumption. But the cost of that framework was not just financial. It required trust. It required the Gulf states to accept a reduced American footprint on the understanding that Washington would consult before acting, would coordinate before striking, and would treat its Gulf partners as allies with legitimate interests rather than as staging grounds for unilateral decisions. What the Gulf states got on Tuesday night was a unilateral decision. No consultation, no advance notice. No coordination with Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, or Doha before missiles were launched over airspace that those governments are responsible for defending. The Saudi Air Defense Command was tracking objects it had not been briefed on. For approximately 14 minutes before the Pentagon alert came through, Saudi radar operators were watching an unidentified strike package move through regional airspace and did not know whether it was American, Israeli, or something else. 14 minutes of not knowing. For a country sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves, 14 minutes of not knowing is not a procedural inconvenience. It is a demonstration of exactly how much the relationship has changed. Washington gambled that the strikes would be quick, clean, and deterrent, that Tehran would pull back, that Gulf partners would quietly accept the outcome, and that markets would stabilize within 48 hours. It assumed its allies would absorb the shock and adjust. That assumption was wrong in a very specific way, and understanding exactly how it was wrong tells you everything about what happens next. At 9:43 p.m. Gulf Standard Time on Tuesday, the first wave of strikes was already in the air. The targets were not random. The Pentagon, in its 2 a.m. press conference, described them as 3 distinct categories: an underground command and control facility near Bandar Abbas that American intelligence had been tracking for 14 months, a set of fast attack boat staging areas along the northern Hormuz coastline that had been used to harass commercial shipping 3 times in the previous 6 weeks, and a fuel and munitions depot that American analysts believed was servicing Iranian proxy naval operations. The strikes used a combination of ship-launched Tomahawk missiles and B-2 delivered precision munitions. Total strike duration, 22 minutes. On the surface, it looked surgical. But while the strikes were landing, something else was also happening. While those 22 minutes of ordnance were being delivered, the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil move every single day, experienced its first complete commercial shipping halt since 2019. Iranian naval vessels began moving into choke point positions. Lloyd's of London's war risk classification for the entire Gulf region was upgraded to Category 4 within 90 minutes of the first strike, meaning that every commercial vessel in the Gulf was now operating in a zone that would trigger maximum insurance surcharges. Ships already in transit stopped. Ships waiting to enter turned around. The halt was not ordered by any government. It was a market response. The ships stopped because it became commercially irrational to keep moving, and that commercial irrationality hit the global oil supply chain like a circuit breaker being thrown. Pause. And at that exact same moment, 4,200 miles away in Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was issuing a statement that had clearly been drafted before the strikes happened. It called for immediate restraint and respect for regional sovereignty. It named the Strait of Hormuz as a global commons requiring multilateral governance. Chinese diplomatic language is precise in a way that English language diplomacy often is not, and the phrase multilateral governance in this context carried a specific meaning. Beijing was signaling that it did not recognize Washington's right to conduct unilateral military action in a waterway through which 26% of China's energy imports travel every single day. While Washington was managing its press conference at 2 a.m., Beijing was already working the phones across the Gulf. The Chinese foreign minister had spoken with his Saudi counterpart by 1:30 a.m. Gulf time before the Pentagon briefing was complete. The financial markets did not wait for the briefing either. Brent crude closed after hours at $97.40 a barrel, the first time it had touched $97 in 19 months. Natural gas futures in Europe spiked 8.7%. The defense sector ETF in New York jumped 4.2% in after-hours trading. And the currencies of 6 Gulf states simultaneously moved off their intraday ranges as sovereign wealth fund managers made the same calculation at the same time. This is not a 48-hour event. This is a structural shift. What happened inside the Gulf capitals in the hours after the strikes is the part of this story that the official accounts have carefully avoided. According to sources familiar with the communications between Riyadh and Washington in the 6 hours following the strikes, the Saudi Crown Prince did not call the American president. That call, which would normally happen within 90 minutes of any major military event in the Gulf, did not happen for 11 hours. And when it happened, sources say it was Washington that initiated it. A senior Gulf diplomat, speaking without attribution, described the mood in the room during the first emergency meeting of Gulf Cooperation Council security advisors early Wednesday morning as follows. The question was not whether America had the right to strike. The question was whether we were consulted. We were not. And that changes the calculation. We have learned from sources in both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that the two governments had been aware of American intelligence indicating elevated Iranian naval activity in the northern Gulf for at least 3 weeks. They had been briefed on the threat assessment. What they had not been told was that a strike decision had been made. What they had not been told was the date, the targets, or the timeline. They were not asked whether the strikes would create problems for their own security posture. They were not given the opportunity to prepare their own populations or their own markets. A private call between the UAE foreign minister and his British counterpart on Wednesday morning was described by a source familiar with its contents as blunt. The UAE wanted to know whether London had known in advance. London said it had not. The UAE said it believed that. London said it was sorry. That exchange, a senior Gulf state telling a NATO ally it was sorry for not being informed about American strikes in its own neighborhood, is the kind of exchange that does not end when the call does. The Iranians, for their part, made a deliberate decision in the hours after the strikes not to retaliate immediately. That decision was not made out of weakness. It was made because Tehran understood something that Washington appeared not to. The absence of immediate Iranian retaliation was itself a form of pressure. Every hour that passed without a counterstrike was an hour in which the Gulf states had to manage their own exposure, in which markets had to price in uncertainty without resolution, in which Washington had to explain to its Gulf partners why they were sitting with the consequences of a decision they had not been part of making. The Iranians were not retreating. They were waiting. And the Gulf states understood the difference. Why did Washington strike now? Follow the logic, not the press release. The administration had been under sustained domestic pressure for 6 weeks over Iranian proxy activity against American assets in Iraq and Syria. 3 American contractors had been killed in a drone strike on a logistics base in eastern Syria on June 4th. The political cost of not responding was becoming higher than the political cost of responding, and an election cycle in which energy prices, military credibility, and regional stability are all on the ballot table creates a specific kind of pressure that makes a visible military action feel like the low-risk option. It was not the low-risk option, but it felt like one from inside the calculation. The power shift that Tuesday's strikes produced is now visible in a way it was not before. Before Tuesday, Washington's Gulf partners operated on the assumption that they had input into major military decisions in their region. That assumption was valuable. It made the alliance worth maintaining. It made the cost of hosting American bases, accepting American over-the-horizon posture, and aligning diplomatically with Washington feel proportionate to what they were getting in return. After Tuesday, that assumption is under review, and when Gulf governments put an assumption about alliance value under review, they do not do it publicly. They do it quietly, through procurement decisions, through investment redirections, through the speed with which they return phone calls, and through which foreign ministers they choose to see first when a crisis breaks. The Chinese foreign minister landed in Riyadh on the Thursday. He had not been scheduled to visit until September. The legal dimension of Tuesday's strikes is also not simple. Three of the targets were located in what Iran claims as its territorial waters under an extended maritime interpretation that the United States does not recognize, but that several international legal bodies have declined to definitively reject. The strikes will face challenge at the International Court of Justice. Iran has already filed a preliminary notice. That process will take years, but the filing itself matters because it creates a legal architecture around the strikes that constrains future American military action in the same geography in ways that are not obvious from the outside, but are very well understood by the lawyers inside the Gulf state governments who have spent the last 48 hours reviewing their own treaty obligations. Washington has committed an act that it cannot uncommit. The strategic question now is whether it has bought deterrence or bought a longer and more expensive version of the problem it was trying to solve. The senior trade economists, who have spent their careers analyzing Gulf energy geopolitics, are calling this the moment the American security umbrella in the Gulf became a conditional offer rather than a structural guarantee. A conditional offer can be repriced. A structural guarantee cannot. That distinction, small sounding in theory, is enormous in practice. Here is what happens from here, in the order it will happen. If the strait remains in shutdown condition for more than 5 days, global oil inventories begin drawing down at a rate that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases cannot offset at scale. If inventories draw down beyond the 12-day threshold, refinery allocation decisions in Europe and Asia begin affecting retail fuel prices. If retail fuel prices in Europe and Asia spike past the psychological thresholds that triggered political crises in 2022, the political cost to allied governments who are publicly aligned with Washington becomes a domestic problem for those governments, not just an American problem. That domino sequence has a clock on it. The clock started Tuesday night. Beijing is watching this with the specific attention of a party that has spent a decade quietly building infrastructure in the Gulf that Washington dismissed as commercial rather than strategic. The Belt and Road investments in Omani port infrastructure, in Saudi logistics, in UAE financial services, those were not just commercial bets, they were relationship bets. And every hour that Washington's Gulf partners sit with the consequences of a decision they were not consulted on is an hour in which the Chinese model of engagement, no military strikes, no unilateral action, consistent commercial presence, looks more attractive by comparison. Where is the bipartisan Senate support for the strikes? Silence. As of Thursday morning, 14 Republican senators had not issued statements. 3 had privately indicated to their offices that they were waiting to see how the Gulf partners responded before they decided what to say publicly. A strike that does not carry domestic political consensus at home and damages alliance relationships abroad is a strike that has created a problem set larger than the one it was designed to solve. The fracture inside the American foreign policy establishment over Tuesday's decision is real, and it is deepening. One faction believes the strikes were necessary and that the Gulf states will absorb the short-term disruption and realign. The other faction believes the administration made a fundamental error in not consulting its Gulf partners and that the relational damage will outlast any deterrent effect the strikes produced. That disagreement is not going away. It will shape every conversation about the Gulf for the next 18 months because the people having the disagreement are the same people who will be making the follow-on decisions. Reports from sources close to the National Security Council describe internal communications in the 48 hours after the strikes as strained. The speed of the Chinese foreign minister's Riyadh trip caught the administration off guard. The failure to anticipate the shipping halt was described in internal assessment documents as a significant intelligence planning gap. The administration that launched the strikes is now managing a situation that moved faster and in more directions than the pre-strike modeling projected. That gap between projection and reality is not a small gap. It is the gap that defines whether Tuesday becomes a deterrent success or a strategic inflection point that historians look back on as the moment American Gulf leadership entered a new and more contested phase. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is the narrowest point through which the modern world passes every single day. 21 million barrels every day. No alternatives at scale. No bypass that functions at commercial volume. The countries that sit on either side of it understand this with a precision that the countries that depend on it passing through without disruption often underestimate. What Tuesday's strikes revealed is not American military strength. Everybody already knew about American military strength. What Tuesday's strikes revealed is the gap between military strength and the relational architecture that makes military strength useful as a deterrent rather than destabilizing as a trigger. You can conduct a strike. You cannot conduct the 14 minutes of Saudi radar operators not knowing what they were looking at. You can control the targets. You cannot control what the silence from Muscat means to every other capital watching the silence. You can win the strike. You cannot automatically win what follows the strike. So where are we right now? Iran has not retaliated militarily, but Iran does not need to retaliate militarily to achieve its objectives this week at Trok. Its objective this week is to let the consequences of Tuesday's decision develop on their own. The shipping halt, the insurance reclassification, the Chinese engagement with Gulf partners, the domestic American political complications, none of these required Iran to fire a single additional weapon. They are the natural consequence of a unilateral strike in a geography where every actor has interdependencies that a strike disrupts whether or not the strike is militarily successful. Saudi Arabia has not broken with Washington, but Saudi Arabia has not publicly defended Washington either. That gap, the space between not breaking and not defending, is where Gulf foreign policy will operate for the next several months. It is a meaningful space. It has real consequences for American basing rights, intelligence cooperation, and the diplomatic framework that makes the over-the-horizon security model functional. As we move through the next 2 weeks, expect Washington to pursue a new meeting with Gulf partners framed around reassurance. Expect that meeting to be harder to schedule than the administration's public statements will suggest. Expect Iran to use the legal challenge at the ICJ as a pressure mechanism that keeps the strikes in the international conversation long after the immediate military situation has stabilized. Expect the oil price not to return to pre-strike levels until the Strait's insurance classification is downgraded back to Category 2. And that classification will not change until commercial shippers are confident that the strike was a singular event rather than the opening of a new operational tempo. The question that every serious analyst in Riyadh, Beijing, Brussels, and Tokyo is sitting with right now is the same question. Was this a one-time demonstration of American willingness to act, or was this the beginning of a more active American military posture in the Gulf that will require everyone to adjust their calculations? That question does not have an answer yet. The answer will come from what Washington does in the next 30 days. Whether it moves to rebuild the consultation framework it broke on Tuesday, whether it can offer Gulf partners something tangible that compensates for the trust that was spent, and whether the domestic political calculation that produced Tuesday's strikes has been satisfied or has simply moved the goalpost to the next target. The Gulf was not panicking on Wednesday morning. People who work at the intersection of energy and geopolitics do not panic. They calculate. They adjust. They begin slowly and quietly moving things, investments, alignments, conversations, commitments, in directions that account for the new information they have received. Tuesday night gave them very specific new information. They are already using it. The full weight of what they build with it will be visible in every conversation that follows. Subscribe and stay close. What moves next will not announce itself in a Pentagon press release. It will move the way strategic shifts always move, quietly, through channels that require someone to be watching before the movement becomes undeniable.